Before the hum of refrigerators, before the seals of canning jars clicked shut in kitchens lit by electric light, before the word expiration date ever appeared on a package, there was this: meat dried under open sky, berries pressed into cakes that would not spoil, corn stored in pits dug deep into the cooling earth. The peoples of this continent knew something we have largely forgotten. They understood that food is not just nourishment for today. It is survival for the winter that always comes. They read the seasons like a language. They worked with sun and wind and smoke as partners. And they created preservation methods so effective, so ingenious, that food could last not days or weeks, but months, sometimes years, without losing its power to sustain life. This was not luck. This was knowledge passed down through generations, tested against hunger and hardship, refined until it became an art form. Are you ready to discover what our ancestors knew about making food immortal? The forgotten science of survival. There is a kind of wisdom that doesn't live in books. It lives in hands that have done the same work for 1,000 years. It lives in the timing of harvest, the angle of wind, the patience required to wait while nature does what no machine can replicate. For the native peoples of North America, from the salmon-rich coasts of the Pacific Northwest to the buffalo plains of the Great Basin, from the cornfields of the eastern woodlands to the arid mesas of the Southwest, preservation was not a convenience. It was the difference between life and death. Winter could stretch for months, game could disappear, rivers could freeze solid. The harvest of autumn had to carry entire communities through seasons when the earth gave nothing. But they did not fear this. They prepared for it with methods that sound almost mystical to modern ears. Yet they were grounded in precise observation of microbiology, chemistry, and physics that we're only now beginning to fully understand through scientific analysis. They knew that removing moisture stops decay, that cold slows bacterial growth, that smoke creates a barrier against insects and introduces antimicrobial compounds, that certain minerals in the earth act as natural preservatives, that fermentation transforms perishable food into something more durable and often more nutritious. These were not primitive people making do with primitive methods. These were master craftspeople, working with their environment in ways so sophisticated that modern food scientists study their techniques with genuine awe. They turned summer's abundance into winter's insurance policy. They created foods so calorie-dense, so perfectly preserved, that a handful could sustain a hunter for days in freezing wilderness. What they knew we have largely forgotten in just a few generations of refrigeration and industrial food systems. But the knowledge still exists in oral traditions and archaeological evidence, in the practices of communities that have maintained these arts despite centuries of disruption. This is that knowledge. These are those secrets. Pemmican, the original survival food. A leather pouch sits in a teepee somewhere on the northern plains in the dead of January. Outside, the wind screams across snow that has turned the landscape into a white void. Inside, a hunter reaches into that pouch and pulls out something that looks almost like a dark bar, compact, dense, slightly oily to the touch. This is pemmican, and it may be the most perfect portable food ever created by human hands. The Cree, the Lakota, the Blackfoot, the Métis, nearly every Plains nation had their version of this legendary food. The name comes from the Cree word Pemmican, derived from pimi, meaning fat or grease. That etymology tells you something crucial. This was not just dried meat. It was dried meat combined with rendered fat in specific proportions that transformed it from simple jerky into a complete nutritional powerhouse that could fuel a human body through the harshest conditions on Earth. The process began with the buffalo hunt, an event that was part spiritual ceremony, part military operation, part urgent race against time. When a hunt succeeded and buffalo lay across the prairie, the work of preservation began immediately. Women and elders organized butchering parties with the efficiency of surgeons. Every part of the animal had purpose, but for pemmican, they needed specific cuts, lean meat from the back, shoulders, and hindquarters. This meat was sliced thin, paper thin where possible, against the grain. Thickness was the enemy of preservation. Any moisture trapped inside would become a breeding ground for bacteria. So the slices were cut with practiced precision, then laid across wooden racks or draped over ropes made of sinew or plant fiber. These racks stood in the open air, angled to catch maximum sun and wind. Here is where the magic of the plains environment became part of the recipe. The hot, dry summer wind of the grasslands, steady, relentless, pulling moisture out of everything it touched, was as essential as any ingredient. The meat would hang for days, sometimes a week or more, turning gradually from red to deep brown to almost black. It would become brittle, light, completely desiccated. When you snapped a piece, it would crack like thin wood. But dried meat alone was not pemmican. It was the fat that made the difference. Buffalo fat, particularly the prize fat from around the kidneys and organs, called depuis, was rendered slowly over low fires. This was delicate work. Too much heat and the fat would burn, becoming bitter and losing its nutritional value. Too little heat and it wouldn't fully liquefy and purify. The goal was clear: golden fat that was shelf-stable and rich in calories. While the fat rendered, the dried meat underwent one more transformation. It was placed on hides and pounded, sometimes with smooth stones, sometimes with specialized wooden tools, until it broke down into a coarse powder or fine fibers. This pounding could take hours. The women who did this work developed forearms of remarkable strength. They often sang while they worked, rhythm helping to maintain the steady strikes needed to break down the tough, dried protein. Then came the combination. The powdered meat was placed in a large container, often a cleaned buffalo stomach or rawhide bag. Hot, liquid fat was poured over it in a ratio of roughly 1 part fat to 1 part dried meat, though this varied by tribe and purpose. If the pemmican was meant for winter storage, more fat. If it was meant for summer travel, slightly less. Sometimes dried berries were added: choke cherries, blueberries, saskatoons, cranberries, which added not just flavor, but vitamin C and additional sugars. These versions were called sweet pemmican and were considered delicacies. Everything was mixed thoroughly, then packed tightly into rawhide bags called parfleche. As the fat cooled, it solidified, creating an airtight seal around every particle of meat. This was the key to pemmican's legendary shelf life. The fat prevented oxygen from reaching the protein, bacteria from colonizing it, moisture from reintroducing the conditions for decay. When properly made, pemmican could last for years. Some accounts suggest decades. Without refrigeration, it was completely portable, incredibly calorie-dense. The fat provided roughly 9 calories per gram, the dried meat another 4, and nutritionally complete enough to sustain life as the sole food source for months. Arctic explorers who adopted pemmican from indigenous peoples considered it superior to any European preserved food. It didn't require cooking. It didn't freeze solid in sub-zero temperatures. A man could survive on a pound a day and maintain strength for hard travel. This was more than food. This was survival compressed into a portable form, a buffer against starvation, a gift of summer that could be opened in the cruelest depths of winter. Smoke and thyme, the art of preserving salmon. The rivers of the Pacific Northwest, the Columbia, the Fraser, the Yukon and its tributaries, run silver in late summer. Millions of salmon, driven by ancient biological imperative, fight upstream against current and gravity, returning to the gravel beds where they were born to spawn and die. For the peoples of these watersheds, the Salish, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Nez Perce, the Chinook nations, this annual return was more than abundance. It was prophecy fulfilled, covenant renewed, the guarantee that the world still worked the way it was meant to work. But salmon spoils faster than almost any other meat. In the warm days of late summer, a whole fish could begin to turn within hours of being caught. Without preservation, this massive seasonal harvest would be impossible to store. So they developed smoking techniques so refined, so precisely controlled, that the resulting product, hard, amber-colored, almost translucent in thin slices, could last an entire year or more. The process began at the fishing sites. Men and boys worked the rivers with spears, nets, and ingenious wooden traps called weirs that funneled entire runs of fish into holding areas. Women and elders waited on shore with cutting stations already prepared. Speed mattered. The fish needed to be processed while still fresh. Each salmon was cleaned with swift, practiced cuts. The head removed, the belly opened in one long slice, guts and eggs carefully separated, nothing wasted. The eggs would be preserved separately, the organs used for immediate eating or for trade. Then came the crucial cut. The salmon was butterflied, opened flat like a book, but left connected along the back. This created a thin, uniform sheet of meat that would dry evenly. Here's where deep knowledge separated successful preservation from rotting waste. The thickness had to be consistent. Any thick spots near the spine, where the collar muscle bunched, were carefully scored or cut thinner. Even thickness meant even drying meant even preservation. The prepared fish were then hung on racks inside specially constructed smokehouses. These weren't casual structures. They were engineered with the precision of any modern facility. They were built tall, 10, 12, sometimes 15 feet high, to create vertical space for the smoke to travel and distribute evenly. The walls were made of cedar planks, fitted close enough to contain smoke, but with deliberate gaps to allow moisture to escape. This circulation was critical. At the base of the smokehouse, fires smoldered, never flamed. The wood choice mattered enormously. Alder was preferred along much of the coast. It burned cool and imparted a mild, sweet flavor. Sometimes maple, never resinous woods like pine or fir, which would make the meat bitter and leave harmful compounds. The goal was smoke, not heat, and not just any smoke. Cool smoke, temperatures staying below 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This is called cold smoking, and it's a fundamentally different process than hot smoking. Hot smoking cooks the meat, which is delicious but reduces shelf life to weeks. Cold smoking dries the meat slowly, allows salt and antimicrobial compounds in the smoke to penetrate deep into the tissue, and creates conditions where bacteria simply cannot thrive. The salmon would hang in that gentle, fragrant smoke for days, sometimes a week, sometimes 2 weeks for the thickest kings. Women tended the fires constantly, monitoring temperature, adjusting airflow, rotating fish to ensure even exposure. This was not work you could walk away from. The smoke had to remain constant. If the fire burned too hot, the outside would cook before the inside dried, trapping moisture that would rot from within. If the fire went out, moisture could condense back onto the meat's surface. As days passed, the salmon transformed. The bright orange-pink flesh darkened to deep rust, then amber, then a translucent brown gold. The texture changed from soft and oily to firm, then hard, then almost glass-like at the thinnest edges. The smell shifted from fresh fish to something more complex, woodsy, slightly sweet, umami-rich. When finished, the fish could be stored in dry areas for a year or more. It could be eaten as is, requiring serious jaw strength, or could be softened by soaking in water or crumbling into soups and stews. It was extraordinarily portable. Incredibly calorie-dense because the drying concentrated all the salmon's fat and protein into a fraction of its original weight, and rich in omega-3 fatty acids that remained stable in the dried state. But beyond nutrition and preservation, there was something else. The entire process, the waiting for the salmon's return, the communal work of catching and processing, the smokehouses standing like temples along the riverbanks, filled with fish and fragrant smoke, was ceremony. It was relationship. It was the acknowledgement that these fish gave their lives so that people could live. And the people's responsibility was to honor that gift by wasting nothing, preserving skillfully, and ensuring that abundance was shared and lasted. The smoke that rose from those smokehouses carried more than preservation compounds. It carried prayers, gratitude, and the knowledge that winter was coming. But hunger didn't have to. The three sisters in the cache pit, storing the harvest underground. The agricultural societies of the eastern woodlands and southwest, the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Pueblo peoples, and dozens of others, built their civilizations on three plants that grew together in spiritual and practical partnership: corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters, they called them. But all the abundance of harvest means nothing if it can't be kept through winter. So they turned to the earth itself as a preservation vessel, using underground storage pits, cache pits, that maintain near-perfect conditions for keeping dried goods safe for months. Picture a Haudenosaunee village in what would become New York in October. the harvest is complete. Mountains of corn, dried on the stalk until the kernels are hard as pebbles, are being shucked by groups of women working together, their hands moving with the speed of long practice. The beans, harvested weeks earlier, are already fully dry in baskets. Winter squash, their skins thick and hard, are piled in the sun for a final few days of curing. If this surprises you, consider how much we've forgotten about working with the earth itself as technology, and share your thoughts below. The land remembers more than we do. The cache pit was humanity's first refrigerator, first pantry, first food preservation technology beyond simple drying. And it worked on principles that are still sound. The pits were dug carefully, usually by men working with wooden digging sticks and stone tools, though later with iron spades traded from European contacts. The location mattered. High ground to avoid flooding, well-drained soil, areas where the water table sat deep below the surface. The soil type mattered too. Sandy loam that wouldn't hold moisture was ideal. Clay could trap water and promote rot. The pits themselves were engineered with precision. They were typically bell-shaped, a narrow opening at the surface, sometimes just 2 feet across, that widened into a chamber 4 to 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide at the base. This shape was not random. The narrow opening could be covered and concealed easily, protecting stores from both animals and potential raiders during times of conflict. The wider base provided maximum storage volume while maintaining structural integrity. The soil's natural compaction held the walls stable. Before anything was stored, the pit was prepared. The walls might be lined with bark, cedar or birch preferred for their antimicrobial properties and resistance to moisture. The bottom was lined with a thick layer of dry grass, then bark, then more grass. This created insulation from ground moisture and provided cushioning for whatever would be stored. Then came the food. Corn was stored still on the cob when possible, stacked carefully in layers. Between layers, more dried grass or leaves, creating separation and air circulation. Beans in woven baskets or leather bags, dried squash, either in whole chunks or in long strips that had been dried like leather. Some communities stored nuts, hickory, acorns, black walnuts, in separate pits, knowing that their oils could go rancid and contaminate other foods if stored together. When the pit was full, the final sealing was crucial. A layer of bark or woven mats went over the top of the food, then dry grass, packed tightly, then a layer of soil, tamped down firm, often a flat stone on top of that, large enough to cover the opening. Finally, more soil, mounded up slightly to shed rain, and often covered with sod or leaves to camouflage it and prevent erosion. What happened inside that sealed pit was simple but effective. The temperature stabilized, staying cool through winter, protected from freezing by the Earth's insulation, and staying relatively cool through summer. The moisture level stabilized. The dried food absorbed slight humidity from the earth, which actually helped prevent brittleness, but never enough to promote mold or bacterial growth. The sealed environment became low oxygen, which further inhibited spoilage organisms that need air to thrive. A well-constructed cache pit in suitable soil could keep dried corn and beans in perfect condition for a year or more. Archaeological excavations have found storage pits in the Southwest that are hundreds of years old, some still containing recognizable corn kernels. But the cache pit was more than just storage. It was insurance. Communities often maintained multiple pits, scattered across their territory containing different foods. If one pit failed, flooding, animal intrusion, mold, others remained safe. If raiders destroyed the village, hidden caches could sustain survivors or provide resources for rebuilding. The pits were maps of foresight, networks of survival, investments in a future that might include hardship. And they represented a profound understanding of what the earth could do. The same soil that grew the food could preserve it. The same ground that took back the dead could keep the living alive through winter. It was partnership, reciprocity, the foundational relationship of agricultural peoples with the land that sustained them. When spring came and the pits were opened, what emerged was not just food, but proof. Proof that careful work in autumn created security in winter. Proof that knowledge passed down through generations still worked. Proof that humans could, with wisdom and effort, extend summer's abundance through winter's scarcity. Jerky, the universal method across a continent, from the southeastern swamps to the Rocky Mountain forests to the desert Southwest. Across thousands of miles and hundreds of distinct nations and tribes, one preservation method appeared in nearly every culture. Dried meat, what would later be called by a Spanish-influenced term, jerky. But this wasn't one technique. It was 1,000 variations on a theme, each adapted to local climate, local game, local wisdom. The Seminole of Florida dried alligator tail meat in the humid hot air of the swamps, using the intense sun and what little dry wind filtered through the cypress trees. They cut the meat thin and treated it with salt traded from the coast, understanding that in high humidity, salt was essential to pull out moisture faster than bacteria could establish themselves. The Shoshone of the Great Basin dried elk, deer, and antelope in the thin, arid air of high desert, where moisture evaporated so quickly that meat could dry in as little as 2 days in the height of summer. They didn't need salt. The environment did the work for them. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic dried caribou and seal meat during the brief summer months, creating stores that would supplement fresh hunting through the dark winter. They sometimes used the wind chill itself as part of the process, the cold air paradoxically drying meat effectively when humidity was low, creating what's sometimes called freeze-dried meat, though ancient peoples wouldn't have used that modern term. But underneath all these variations, certain principles held constant, principles that reveal sophisticated understanding of biology and chemistry. First, thickness matters. Meat needed to be sliced thin enough that the interior would dry before the exterior formed a moisture-impermeable crust. The ideal thickness was about 1/4 inch, though this varied with climate. In humid regions, thinner. In arid regions, slightly thicker was possible. Second, airflow matters. Meat couldn't be piled or touching. Each piece needed to be exposed to moving air on all surfaces. This is why racks were universal. Wooden frames, sometimes just branches lashed together, that suspended meat so air circulated completely around each piece. Third, temperature matters, but not the way you might think. Very hot temperatures, above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, could cook the outside of the meat before the inside dried, trapping moisture. The ideal was warm but not hot, 90 to 110 degrees with good airflow. This is why direct sunlight was used in some regions, but shade with good air movement was preferred in others. Fourth, protection matters. Drying meat attracts flies, which will lay eggs that hatch into maggots. Many nations use smoke specifically to keep insects away, even if the smoke itself wasn't concentrated enough to preserve. Others dried meat in thin bags made of cheesecloth, like woven plant fibers, that allowed airflow but excluded insects. Some used rotating watch schedules to brush flies away during peak laying times. Fifth, timing matters. The best time to make jerky was late summer through early fall in most regions. Warm enough for quick drying, but past the peak of insect season. Some cultures had specific moon phases or natural signs that indicated the ideal moment. When certain plants went to seed, when certain insects stopped appearing, when the character of the wind changed. The meat itself was often treated before drying. Many nations rubbed it with salt when salt was available. Some used mineral-rich clay slurries. Some marinated it briefly in water that had been infused with sage, juniper, or other antimicrobial plants, both for flavor and for preservation enhancement. And the meat choices mattered. Lean meat dried better than fatty meat. Fat didn't dry, it went rancid. So the prime cuts for jerky were the lean muscles, deer backstrap, elk round, buffalo shoulder. The fatty cuts were either eaten fresh, rendered for their fat, or preserved by other methods. The finished product, hard, dark, lightweight, could last for months under proper conditions. It had to be stored in dry places, often in leather bags or woven baskets that allowed slight air circulation while keeping out moisture and insects. Some nations stored jerky in layers separated by dried leaves, bay, sage, cedar, that added antimicrobial protection and flavor. When it was time to eat jerky, it could be consumed as is, though it required strong teeth and patient chewing. More often it was softened, either by sucking on it until saliva rehydrated it, or by adding it to soups and stews, where it would absorb water and become tender again while adding deep, concentrated flavor to the dish. But perhaps the most important thing about jerky was its democracy. You didn't need specialized equipment. You didn't need rare ingredients. You didn't need unusual environmental conditions, though some environments made it easier. What you needed was meat, knife, sun or shade, air, and time. It was accessible preservation, survival knowledge that could be practiced by anyone willing to learn, and that knowledge spread. When different nations met, for trade, for ceremony, for war, for alliance, they shared techniques. The universal need to preserve meat created a universal language of dried foods, one of humanity's earliest common technologies. The simplicity was the genius. The accessibility was the power. And the result was that for thousands of years before refrigeration, meat didn't have to be eaten immediately or wasted. Summer's hunt could feed winter's hunger. A successful kill could sustain a family for weeks. Wild rice in the birch bark harvest, preserving the water's gift. The lakes and slow rivers of the northern woodlands, the region the Anishinaabe call the land of the great waters, turned golden brown in late summer. The wild rice, manuman in the Ojibwe language, stands tall in the shallows, heavy seed heads bending toward the water's surface. This is not the domesticated rice of Asian paddies. This is Zizania palustris and Zizania aquatica, aquatic grasses native to North America, producing grains that are nutty, complex, and extraordinarily nutritious. And unlike many wild foods, wild rice is remarkably easy to store for months or even years, if you know the old methods. The harvest itself is a study in cultural sophistication. Canoes, traditionally made of birch bark, light enough for 2 people to carry, sealed with pine resin, designed specifically for this work, move through the rice beds in late August and early September. One person pulls the canoe slowly forward through the dense stands. The other sits holding 2 wooden sticks, each about 3 feet long. These are not threshing flails. They're gentler than that. With one stick, the harvester bends a handful of rice stalks over the side of the canoe. With the other stick, they tap, not beat, but tap, the seed heads. Ripe grains fall into the canoe bottom. Unripe grains stay attached, left for next week's pass or for the ducks and other birds who depend on this food. It's elegant, it's sustainable. The same bed can be harvested multiple times as different plants ripen, and it requires knowledge. Which stands are ready, which need more time, how hard to tap, too hard and you shatter the hulls. Too soft and ripe grain doesn't fall. How to move through the beds without damaging plants. The canoe gradually fills with a mixture of ripe rice grains, leaves, empty hulls, and insects. By the end of a day's harvesting, a skilled team might have gathered 50 to 100 pounds of unprocessed rice. But this rice cannot be stored in its raw state. It's still moist, the kernels still contained in hulls, the chaff mixed throughout. Without processing, it would mold within days. So the work of preservation begins immediately. The rice is spread on birch bark sheets or woven mats in the sun, ideally in a location with good air movement. It needs to dry partially to reduce moisture content from around 35–40% down to about 15 to 20%. This takes a day or 2 of good weather. Women and children tend it, stirring it periodically, covering it quickly if rain threatens. Once partially dried, the rice undergoes one of the most distinctive parts of traditional processing, parching. In Ojibwe communities, this often happened in large, shallow birch bark trays or metal pots, after metal became available through trade, suspended over fires. The rice was stirred constantly to prevent burning. The goal was to heat it to around 200–300 degrees Fahrenheit, which would finish drying the kernels, expand them slightly, and crucially, make the hulls brittle so they could be removed. This parching required skill and attention. The rice had to be kept moving. If any settled to the bottom too long, it would burn and ruin the entire batch with acrid flavor. The smell guided the process. The rice would release a nutty, toasted aroma when properly parched. Too long, and that smell would shift to something burnt. Some communities parch rice in a different, labor-intensive but effective way, the jigging or dancing method. Parched rice was placed in a shallow pit lined with deer hide or in a birch bark container. A person, often a young man chosen for strong legs and good balance, would put on special clean moccasins and literally dance on the rice, moving constantly, using the friction and gentle crushing motion to loosen the hulls from the grains without breaking the grains themselves. This could take an hour or more per batch. After parching or jigging, the rice needed winnowing. On a breezy day, women would stand with birch bark baskets filled with the parched rice and chaff mixture. They'd toss it into the air, letting wind carry away the lightweight hulls and broken bits while the heavier grains fell back into the basket. This might be repeated a dozen times or more until the rice was clean. Dark, elongated grains, some split open, revealing pale interiors, smelling like autumn and fire and wild water. This finished rice was ready for storage, kept in birch bark containers called makakun, or leather bags in a cool, dry place. Wild rice could last for years. The low moisture content prevented bacterial or fungal growth. The hull removal prevented insect infestation. The parching had actually improved the nutritional availability of some nutrients and given the rice its characteristic flavor. But wild rice was more than just a storable grain. It was ceremony, calendar, law, and identity. The Ojibwe Ricing Treaty Rights, negotiated in the 19th century and upheld in courts even today, recognized that this wasn't simply food harvesting. It was cultural practice, spiritual connection, intergenerational knowledge transfer, seasonal rhythm, and economic sustenance all bound together. The birch bark containers that held the rice were themselves works of art and engineering. The bark had to be harvested at the right time. Late spring when the sap ran and the bark peeled easily. It was cut in sheets, folded and sewn with spruce root, sealed with pine resin. These containers were lightweight, waterproof, breathable enough to prevent condensation, and durable enough to last for years of hard use. And in those containers, through the long winter, families would open them periodically and find the same nutty, dark grains, ready to be boiled into porridge, mixed into soups, or combined with meat and maple sugar to make nutritious, satisfying meals that sustain people through the harshest months. The water gave the rice, the fire parched it, the wind winnowed it, the birch held it. And the knowledge of how to work with all of these elements, that was the real preservation, passed down through countless generations, still practiced today by communities who remember. Dried berries and fruit leather, preserving summer's sweetness. Summer in North America was an explosion of fruits and berries across nearly every ecosystem. Blueberries in the north woods, strawberries in meadows and clearings, chokecherries and serviceberries on the plains, cactus fruits in the southwest, blackberries and raspberries along forest edges, huckleberries in the mountains. This abundance was brief, a few weeks, sometimes just days, when each plant's fruit reached perfect ripeness. And fruit is perhaps the most perishable of all foods. A ripe berry is essentially a package of sugar and water wrapped in delicate skin, designed by the plant to attract animals who will eat it and spread its seeds. It's meant to be attractive, soft, delicious, and consumed quickly. But native peoples across the continent developed preservation methods that turned this ephemeral sweetness into something that could last through winter and provide not just calories, but crucial vitamins, particularly vitamin C, that were scarce in cold months. The simplest method was sun drying, but simple doesn't mean easy or unsophisticated. Berries were collected at peak ripeness, not underripe, which would lack flavor and sugar, and not overripe, which would be too fragile and ferment too easily. They were spread in single layers on racks covered with woven mats, or later cloth, placed in full sun with good air movement. Small berries, blueberries, serviceberries, currants, could be dried whole. They would shrink to a fraction of their original size, the skins toughening, the interior becoming dense and sweet. In good drying weather, hot, low humidity, steady breeze, this could happen in 3 to 5 days. Larger fruits required different handling. Chokecherries, astringent when raw but delicious when processed, were often mashed, pits and all, then formed into cakes and dried. The pits contained compounds that added bitter almond notes, and they were small enough to be relatively safe. These dried cakes became extremely hard and could be broken into pieces, ground into powder, or softened in water. Cactus fruits, prickly pear and others, were peeled of their spines and skin, then either dried in pieces or mashed into pulp and dried in sheets. These fruit leathers were chewy, intensely flavored, and incredibly stable. The southwestern peoples, particularly in desert regions where the sun was intense and humidity low, became masters of creating these fruit leathers. They would mash fruits, prickly pear, yucca fruits, mesquite pods, into thick pastes, sometimes mixing in ground seeds or nuts for additional nutrition. These pastes were spread on flat stones or woven mats, exposed to the sun, and allowed to dry into thin, flexible sheets. The chemistry here is straightforward but effective. Fruits are high in natural sugars, fructose, glucose, sucrose. As water evaporates, the concentration of these sugars increases. At certain concentrations, sugar itself becomes a preservative, creating an environment where bacteria and molds cannot thrive because the osmotic pressure literally pulls moisture out of any microorganism trying to colonize the food. But there were challenges, particularly in humid regions. In the Pacific Northwest, where rainfall was frequent and humidity high even on sunny days, sun drying alone wasn't reliable. So coastal peoples used smoke drying for some berries, the same smokehouses that processed salmon also preserving service berries and huckleberries. The smoke added flavor and antimicrobial compounds while the heat gently drove off moisture. Some nations used heat drying near fires for certain fruits, not over direct flame, which would cook and burn, but near enough to create warm, dry air. This worked especially well for wild plums and other fruits with higher moisture content. The dried berries and fruit leathers were stored in baskets, leather bags, or birch bark containers, often with layers of leaves, mint, cedar, bay, between layers of fruit to prevent sticking and add preservation properties. These preserved fruits weren't just treats, they were medicine. Scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that plagued European explorers and navies, was essentially unknown among native peoples who maintained traditional diets. The dried berries, though they'd lost some of their vitamin C to oxidation during drying and storage, retained enough to prevent deficiency when consumed regularly through winter, and they were cooking ingredients. Dried berries were added to pemmican, as mentioned earlier, but they were also rehydrated and used in sauces for meat, mixed into porridges made from wild rice or corn, combined with maple sugar to make desserts, or simply chewed as portable snacks during hunting or travel. The work of berry preservation was often communal and often joyful. Families and friends would gather during harvest time, moving through known patches. Berry locations were carefully guarded knowledge, sometimes used by the same families for generations. Picking together, telling stories, teaching children which berries were safe and which weren't, how to pick without damaging the plants, how to leave some for the animals and for next year's growth. And there was respect. Many nations had ceremonies around first fruits, offering some of the first harvest back to the earth or to the plant spirits, acknowledging the gift and asking for continued abundance. This wasn't superstition. It was recognition of relationship, that these plants sustained human life, and humans had responsibilities to sustain the plants in return. There is something almost miraculous about food that doesn't spoil. In a world before refrigeration, before chemistry understood bacteria, before microscopes revealed the invisible organisms that cause decay, people observed, experimented, remembered, and refined. They watched how sun and wind affected meat. They noticed that food stored underground stayed cooler and lasted longer. They discovered that certain plants, when added to storage containers, seemed to slow rot. They learned that smoke did something protective beyond just keeping flies away. They understood that fat could seal moisture out and create barriers that time couldn't easily penetrate. And they passed this knowledge down, parent to child, elder to young adult, community to community, through demonstration, through story, through the careful watching of hands that had done this work for lifetimes. These preservation methods were not folklore. They were not primitive guesses. They were precise technologies developed through generations of observation and testing, refined until they worked reliably enough to stake survival upon. Modern food scientists, when they analyze these traditional methods, find sophisticated applications of microbiology, chemistry, and physics, principles that we've only recently been able to explain with scientific terminology, but which were understood practically for thousands of years. Consider what was accomplished. Pemmican that could outlast any modern energy bar, remaining nutritious and edible for years without a single preservative chemical. Smoked salmon so perfectly preserved that it rivaled anything modern food technology could create. Underground storage that maintained ideal temperature and humidity without electricity. Dried fruits that retained enough nutrition to prevent diseases that killed European sailors by the thousands. This wasn't survival despite primitive conditions. This was thriving because of intimate knowledge. Knowledge of seasons, of weather patterns, of the properties of plants and animals, of how to work with natural process rather than against them. And much of this knowledge has faded. In just a few generations of refrigeration, industrial food systems, and supermarket convenience, we've lost skills that sustained entire civilizations. Most people today couldn't preserve enough food to feed themselves through a single winter without modern technology. The ancestors would find this both puzzling and concerning, but the knowledge isn't entirely lost. It lives in communities that have maintained these practices. It lives in archaeological evidence that scientists continue to study with growing respect. It lives in oral histories, in the memories of elders, in the hands of people who still fish the salmon runs, who still harvest wild rice, who still make pemmican the old way. And it lives in moments like this, when we pause to remember that our species survived and flourished for millennia before the invention of the refrigerator, the canning jar, the freeze dryer. We did it through observation, patience, respect for natural processes, and the willingness to learn from those who came before. The foods described here, pemmican, smoked salmon, cachey stored corn, jerky, wild rice, dried berries, were more than preservation techniques. They were relationships between people and land, people and seasons, people and the plants and animals that sustained them. They were insurance policies against uncertainty, acts of hope that winter would eventually yield a spring, and practical demonstrations that with knowledge and effort, abundance could be extended far beyond its natural season. There is something we need from this old wisdom, especially now. Not because we should abandon refrigeration or modern preservation. These technologies have their place and have saved countless lives, but because the principles underneath these ancient methods still matter. The value of reducing waste, of working with natural processes, of understanding where food comes from and what it takes to keep it, of building resilience into our food systems rather than assuming the supply chain will always hold. The ancestors knew that harvest season was generous and winter was not, that food was precious and knowledge was survival, that preservation was not convenience but necessity. They knew that the land provided, but only if you understood what the land was saying. If you want to learn more of these old arts, the forgotten knowledge that sustained peoples for thousands of years, subscribe and walk with us into the next lesson. Share this with someone who listens to the land. The old ways remember what we've forgotten.